Hi guys, so today's lesson is our first lesson on studying genocide and with a specific focus on the Holocaust. So this unit is we're going to move through this unit quite quickly. We're going to spend about 2 weeks on this unit, but the unit does look at one of the worst crimes that exists in that humans commit, the idea of genocide and what that is. So it is quite a difficult topic to discuss some of the times. It's a lot of very emotive material within it, and it shows some of the darker, most dreadful parts of humanity. So just be aware of that when we are looking at this topic. So for today, we want to have a good understanding of genocide and what that means. So task one for today, what I want you to do here is there's an image there, very famous image that looks at trying to represent genocide and what genocide is. So what I want you to do is to study this image. I want you to tell me how many different events or places are named here. Okay, what do you notice about the dates and inscriptions on each of these headstones? And what do you think the image is trying to tell us? So what I'm going to suggest that you do here is pause the video and spend 3 or 4 minutes actually looking at this, looking at the date, looking at the inscriptions, thinking about the image and coming up with a good understanding of it. So you should pause now. Okay, so most of you will have gotten that there seems to be 8 different events or places named here. So we have Armenia down the front, we have the Holocaust, we have Cambodia, Bosnia, etc. All of these headstones are there to represent a terrible, terrible event within human history. Right? These are some of the worst crimes that have been committed. Now you'll notice the Holocaust, and this is the one that the genocide that we will be discussing in most detail over the next 2 weeks, is represented by the largest headstone here. Okay, and that is to do with the huge impact that the Holocaust had and the immense levels of death that it resulted in. But that does not in any way mean that the other genocides were not terrible, terrible events just as well. Okay, so quite a few named here. Things you might notice with the inscription. Notice the dates. So we have most of them happening in the 1900s. Okay, so it's 20th century. So what we can learn from this is that genocide can often be considered quite a modern issue. Right? Now, whilst there was definitely terrible massacres before the 20th century, we can see that in the 20th century we have the technology to really have devastating impacts upon our fellow man and our fellow human beings. So this is very much something that is being a huge issue in the 20th century. Huge numbers of innocent people being slaughtered due to terrible racial and nationalistic prejudices. The inscription underneath each of them also says "Never again." Now that's an important inscription because it's what we all want to achieve. That this will never happen. That we don't ever want this to happen again. However, the fact that each of them says it, and that there's subsequent ones after each genocide is mentioned, there's another genocide happening, right? So we have here the Holocaust in 1938 to 1945. Then we have underneath that Cambodia 1975 to 1979. So it's definitely that this is an ongoing issue. And some of you may have noticed Darfur over here on the right hand side, and it's 2003, and there is no end date. That's very, very important. Right? Genocide is something the world is currently dealing with, and it's something you should be aware of what's going on, because it's something that shouldn't be happening. Okay, so well done if you got all of those different points. All right, there's a lot of information within that image. I think it's a very good representation of the failings of humanity to stop these terrible, terrible crimes being committed. Okay, so today what we're looking at is just understanding the term genocide, and I want you to be aware of the history of different examples of genocide around the world. Okay, now there is quite a number of points that we might not be able to get into. We are limited by time, and whilst I would love to have long discussions about all of this and really dig into it, we do have a timetable to keep up with. Okay, so we will have to move quite quickly through it. All right, please do go out and do extra research on this. It's a very important topic and something you should be very aware of. All right, so to start off with, what is genocide? What is this term? I keep using it. What does it actually mean? Now, there is different interpretations of what it means, okay? But generally, what we can state is that genocide is the denial of the right of existence of entire human groups, right? And is a crime under international law, whether it's committed on religious, racial, political, or any other grounds. So the important thing here is denial of the right of existence of an entire group. Okay, so it's choosing a group of humans and deciding these people do not deserve to exist, and then usually putting in a systemized way of trying to exterminate these people, to get rid of an entire group of people. Now, it's not always totally systemized, okay? Sometimes things are a bit more spontaneous, but it is choosing a group of people and deciding that they do not have the right to exist, and that is what we term genocide. Okay, so it's a very, very extreme crime. Okay, so one example that I'm going to talk to you about now, in the booklet I'm sending out, you'll see that there are a number of examples being discussed in that booklet. Today I'm just going to go through one example, and this is looking at the Cambodian genocide. Okay, now I want to point out that I am absolutely not an expert on the genocide in Cambodia, and please do go out if this is something that you would like to know more about. Please do go and research in a bit more detail. Okay, but it's very, very important that you are aware of some of the basic facts of what's going on in terms of different genocides. So, Cambodia. So, as I'm going through, what you're going to be doing is looking to answer these questions. So, I'm going to talk about this genocide for about the next 5 to 6 minutes. You can also use the information in your booklet. This is task 2. So, today you're going to be submitting on Teams 2 different tasks to me. You're going to submit task 2 and task 3 as written submissions to me on Teams. So, write down the answers to these questions, and then you're going to submit them on Teams later. So, Cambodian genocide. The Cambodian genocide started with a group called the Khmer Rouge, which were a communist group in Cambodia coming to political power. Right? The Khmer Rouge had started in the northern areas of Cambodia, in quite rural parts of the country, and really what they wanted to do was to bring this rural style of living. They romanticized this idea of living in small, self-sufficient towns and villages, and they wanted to make their whole country exist in this way. They saw it as getting away from the corruption of modern urban life. Right? So they wanted to bring back the country hundreds of years, bring progress back a couple of 100 years into what they had idealized and romanticized as being a perfect way of living. Now, of course, if you bring people back to society back hundreds of years, there are huge, huge issues with this. There are issues with, whilst they romanticize and say, oh, everyone will live in these beautiful little villages and communes and they'll all get along, what you're actually doing is you're taking away a lot of the infrastructure that allows modern health, modern progress, modern education, all of these different things to exist. But when the Khmer Rouge came into power, they weren't willing to listen to anyone. They came into power, they had their idea of what they wanted Cambodia to be, and they were going to force this through. Okay, so they came to power first in 1975 under the leadership of a man named Pol Pot. Okay, they overthrew the government that were already in existence and began to set up their new country, their way of running a country. They did change the name of the country, and now I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong. Kampuchea. I apologize. I could be pronouncing that very badly. And within their country, they wanted to move people away from the cities. They wanted people to live in small rural areas that were self-sufficient, maybe had small bit of trading between each other, but lived in a very rural lifestyle. Now, in order to achieve this, they were willing to go to very, very extremes in order to force this through. Okay, first of all, they set about closing the country off from the outside world. They didn't want anyone from the outside world getting in. They didn't want their people leaving. They didn't want news of what they were doing to spread. They wanted Cambodia to exist as an isolated area. Right? So they set about cutting their country off. Next, they began forcing city dwellers, anyone who lived in urban areas. They were trying to get rid of these cities, and they set about forcing these people out of their homes, forcing anyone who lived in cities out into the countryside. Now, of course, a lot of people would not have liked this, but it wasn't a choice. You didn't have the option to disagree, and it dealt very, very severely with people who stood up to them. Okay? They wanted to get rid of religion, and this is a common aspect of communism. They wanted to get rid of the idea of religion, and they wanted to get rid of anyone who would question their way of doing things. And so they began targeting a number of different groups. One, they would target anyone who was exhibiting religious practices. So huge numbers of Buddhist monks were targeted and executed by the Khmer Rouge. They targeted anyone who they seen as being intellectual and having the intellectual ability to stand up to them. This went to the extent of looking at people who could speak a second language, were being seen as far too educated, and so were targeted. You could see they went as far as to target people simply because they wore glasses. Because if you're wearing reading glasses, why are you looking to read? Because you were trying to be educated. Okay, so they're looking at getting rid of all of these people. So there's an extreme way of dealing with the people. Okay, and huge numbers of people were executed for totally innocent people for simply not looking or not acting the way the Khmer Rouge expected them to. All right. They also they had ideas of racial purity and wanted to get rid of any other ethnicity that wasn't what they deemed ethnic Cambodian. So people who were ethnically Vietnamese, Thai, and Chinese were targeted, were attacked, tortured, brutalized, killed on large scales. Right? They also targeted a group called the Muslim Cham people. As they set about their work, this terrible work of forcing people onto farms, which were basically forced labor farms, that they kept people there and controlled people through intimidation and torture. When people would disagree, the Khmer Rouge set up this system of what became known as killing fields, where anyone who was deemed undesirable, anyone who was deemed to be causing a problem or having the potential to cause a problem, were simply brought to these mass execution sites and executed. And these became known as the killing fields. And it's very much something that people are aware of. When we refer to this, people refer to the killing fields, these mass execution sites. Okay. They had prisons for anyone who stood up to them. One such prison being, again, I apologize, my pronunciation is probably not that bad, Tuol Sleng prison. This one prison alone saw 17,000 people go through it in the 4 years of their control. Of those 17,000 people, only 7 people survived. Okay, so really extreme ways of controlling the country. Not only were they attacking and intimidating people who stood up to them or people who they deemed to be a problem, they were going further and attacking the families and executing the families of these people. There was a huge level of fear and intimidation going on. So, the Khmer Rouge keep power for 4 years. They are extreme in their violence. They are setting out to exterminate anyone who is not ethnically what they deem they should be. Anyone who is willing to stand up to them politically is targeted. Anyone who is actively exhibiting religious beliefs is targeted. And by the end of their 4 years, somewhere between 1.7 and 3 million Cambodian people have died because of the actions of the Khmer Rouge. So it's an extremely difficult part, or very upsetting part of history to think about. But this is just one example of what genocide is. This is what happens with genocides. Okay, so you can see that this is something, when we get into the Holocaust, which we'll be studying in a bit more detail, and when you're looking at some of the other genocides later in this lesson, you're going to see that this kind of extremeness, this total disregard for human life, is something that goes across genocides. If you look at the image here, I think it's a good representation. You see Pol Pot and you see these people behind him, representative of the Communist Party, the Khmer Rouge, and you can see them sitting on the bones of their people. Okay, and look at their faces smiling. Okay, you can see the symbolism perhaps of the Red Book being the symbolism of communism, the army uniforms, and all of this jumble, this huge mass of bodies and bones underneath of the people that they have executed in order to get their way. Right. So that is just a very quick overview of the Cambodian genocide. Okay, now there's a huge amount more information you could be looking into there, but I just wanted to give you an overview of what genocides look like, what we're talking about here, the real human cost of this crime and what it does to people. Okay. So look back over, answer those questions that are on the board, okay, on the screen. Again, you're going to submit those questions to me on Teams. The final task for today then is a bit of independent research. So what I want you to do is to research another genocide, another example of this terrible crime, and you're going to write a short paragraph explaining the events of one of these. Now, some examples, these are not the only genocide, but some examples you might look at is the Rwandan genocide of 1994, the Armenian genocide of 1915 to 1922, and the Darfur genocide, which began in 2003 and is actually still ongoing. Okay, so what I want is a short paragraph, 7-8 sentences explaining, where it's happening, when it happened, who was targeted, what was the excuse for, what was the terrible reason for targeting these people, how many people died as a result, etc. Give an overview of this. And what I'm looking for you to do here is really just have a good understanding of what genocide is, and why it's such a terrible thing, and why we need to be aware of it. Okay. If you want some further reading, there's a link down at the bottom there. I know you're not going to be able to click on it in the video. I'll put it up with the task on Teams. It's just a bit of further reading if you want to learn a bit more about the issue of genocide in the modern world. Okay, so what you're doing at the end of this is you're going to submit task 2 and task 3 to me on Teams, please. Okay, and then I will see you on Thursday for a live lesson. Alright, thanks guys. Any questions, just give me an email and I'll get back to you as soon as I can.